Hello everyone, I'm really excited to be with you today. We're using some new technology, but nonetheless, I'm confident that we're going to be able to talk about the things that we need to. Now today I'm going to talk with you a little bit about the science of mindful wellness, and I say science for a specific reason in that we are going to talk about some of the scientific pathways and some of the chemical pathways that exist within the body. That having been said, try not to worry too much about the infinite details that maybe exist in some of those systems and more about the principles that we're teaching. And the principles that I'm going to share with you are really focused around our Adaptiv product. Now, the Adaptiv product has, of course, the capsules and it has essential oil blends, and we'll talk about both of those in our time together today. So let's begin by talking a little bit about stress. Now, we all respond differently to stress. We all have different stressors that are active in our life. What might be very stressful to me may not be stressful to you in any sense of the word. That having been said, however, when we do react and respond to stress, it is nearly identical for all of us in terms of chemistry and pathway. Now, there's also some differentiation that exists with the types of stress. You've heard me say perhaps that stress is just stress and that everything that happens and occurs within the body is just chemistry. While that's true, there are different perceptions associated with stress. For example, good stress, usually these are things that are episodic within our body. They're not long-lasting, and so they're not chronic in nature, can actually be healthy for us. It improves our cognitive function. It increases our immune capability. It even can help to prepare us for additional stressors that we might experience at some time in the future. Regardless of the cause or the reason for our individual stress, another important thing to remember as we begin to talk about this today is the pathway that's involved with the different stressors that we receive. Now, we're going to call this the stress axis, and we may or may not refer to that as we go throughout our time together today. But if I do refer to it, you'll know that I'm talking simply about the pathway, and it flows in this way, that if we have some type of a stressor that's created, it's followed by a chemical response, a physiological change, and then a feedback loop that allows the body to once again come into balance and to normalize. Here's why that's so critical and why that's important for us to remember. First, let me tell you that what we experience emotionally tends to be what we experience physically or physiologically. Now, by emotions, I don't only mean how we feel. What's the activity that we're experiencing and how do we feel about that? Are we happy? Are we sad? Or do we have other emotions? Well, that is a key and an important part of it. It's also our perception of the events that we have occurring around us. And it's our perception, and whether those are long-term or short-term, which allows us to have physiological change. Remember, I showed you the stress axis, that we have some type of a stressful event, we have a chemical response, and then a physiological response, and then the body normalizes. It's when the body fails to normalize, or the stressors that we are experiencing persist for a long period of time, that we have physiological change. And some of the physiological change that we experience can actually be dynamic and quite harmful. So you can see what some of these are. It can be everything from a lack of energy to we have a lot of metabolic change within the body. We can also have cardiovascular distress and many other things that develop from unmanaged and uncontrolled stressors within our bodies. Perhaps the most important question we can ask ourselves is, when does stress actually become harmful? Now, we've been talking a little bit about the length of time we're associated with stress or chronic stress, but that's not the only denominator that we need to consider. Certainly that carries its own circumstances that can be damaging and unwanted. I'm going to introduce a term to you, and it's a term that admittedly I made up, and we're going to call this term coping capacity. But when I explain it to you, I think it'll make some good sense, and it helps you to understand how we all fall within this dynamic of ongoing and continual and constant stress within the body for many different reasons. So coping capacity is our body's physiological ability to manage and be able to respond to the different types of stressful circumstances that we experience. And most of us over time are going to find that our coping capacity, whatever that happens to be, whatever our own ability is that way, will work within that capacity quite nicely, especially if things are just circumstantial or they're of short duration or situational. On occasion, however, we'll find ourselves that we may dip outside of our body's capacity, as you see indicated by the scale, and we go into an area that I call the coping gap, or this is an area of concern. This is where I begin to challenge my body physiologically in some of the ways that we just explained a few minutes ago. Now, the other thing to consider here is that while coping capacity is essential, we can diminish our body's ability to cope adequately, and we actually reduce the coping capacity. Now, the way that we do that, ironically enough, is mainly lifestyle choices. And so inadequate sleep, poor nutrition, sedentary lifestyle. I have listed here also adrenal fatigue, and I put adrenal fatigue because ironically enough, when we're suffering in any of the previous three circumstances that I identified, that's one of the outcomes that we can see. And of course, unfortunately, at times, people find themselves with illness or other circumstances that can also reduce their coping capacity. What that means is that we find ourselves generally in a circumstance where all of the situations that we find ourselves within, we can most generally be able to react and respond to those. But if we find ourselves in a situation either where the circumstance has become chronic, or in this case where our capacity has been diminished, then things that otherwise were seemingly normal now far exceed our capacity, and we find ourselves in the physiological changes. So with that as a basic understanding of how our body reacts and responds, and the understanding that that is normal for all of us, let's talk about some things that we can do that will help us to overcome that with some consistency. So the first thing I'm going to approach with you just really quickly is what we do in terms of our diet. Now, of course, we can make healthy eating choices, but I'm going to add in addition to that, what do we do in terms of supplementing our body's needs? And so I'm going to give you a reminder about lifelong vitality. Now, lifelong vitality is comprised of three primary components: the alpha-CRS, the Z-omega, and of course the microplex VMZ. Some of the things that make this product very unique is that they were formulated to function together. They also are comprised in a foundational sense of the things that we need for proper and healthy cell function and system function as a whole within the body. For example, we know that our cells need cofactors. We know that they need fatty acids. We know that the metabolism that's driven within the body, it's essential that we have adequate vitamins and minerals that are present. So please use the lifelong vitality as a core foundational element to what we need to do nutritionally to create the proper foundation for ourselves. Now I'm going to talk just briefly about the gut-brain connection. Now while this isn't something new, this is something that more and more people are talking about, and you can find more and more information about this. But the concept is actually really simple. We generally talk about the gut flora because of its protection that it provides for us in an immune capability sense. However, we know that the gut flora, the microflora that exists within the intestinal tract, does much, much more. And one of the things that we see with the microflora is that it has a connection into some of the functioning of the brain in a healthy sense, specifically dealing with neurotransmitters, so things like serotonin. Good example of this is about 90% of all of the serotonin that's produced in the body is produced by the microflora that exists within your intestinal tract. And so it's a great management and plays a role in the part of how we are able to control behavior, stress, and even mood. Now we also have, in counterpart to that, we have associated with the gut-brain connection the control of motility, of digestion, and delivery of microbial balance to the intestinal tract itself. So we have this very unique connection where the two of them work together. And so of course I'm going to talk with you about make sure that you're doing PB Assist because it also is foundational. Now, I know that we all know and understand the value of probiotics, and we probably don't need to spend a lot of time here. But I will give you a reminder that this probiotic is a little bit different. partly because we have a lot of different microbes and we have a lot of proliferation or colonization that exists within the digestive tract, which is essential and important to a probiotic for usage. But then we also have specialized delivery, which is one of the things that helps us to accomplish that so well. And then I also need to talk with you just briefly about enzymes. Remember earlier we talked about the lifelong vitality and we talked about vitamins and minerals. Well, vitamins and minerals are effective in the metabolic processes of the body, but they must have metabolic enzymes to work with them and vice versa. And so we give you a good digestive enzyme so that your body is free to produce all of the metabolic enzymes that it needs. Now, with that as a foundational piece for nutrition, let's talk a little bit about brain chemistry and brain function. Now, this might seem like it's going to become very complicated. I promise you it won't. First, understand that your brain, Harvard University says that your brain likely has millions of different chemical reactions that occur at any given moment in time. We know that the brain is complex, and we know that the systems of the brain are complex, and so we also can assume that managing and working with stressful outcomes within the body can be equally difficult to understand. So let's break it down, and let's make it really simple and easy to follow. You're all familiar with the limbic system, probably in one way or another. Many people refer to it as the emotional system in the body. But the limbic system does much, much more. And while I don't have all of the components of the limbic system listed here, I'm going to talk about those that I feel are most important, and it includes two very critical components. It's the amygdala and it's the hypothalamus, and their reaction and their response in the body as it pertains to how we deal with and how we manage stressful circumstances in the body. And so we're going to talk about two critical pathways. First is a pathway through the central nervous system, and the second is a pathway through the olfactory system. And generally, we make this connection of the olfactory system to the limbic system and the amygdala and the hypothalamus, but we can actually do the same thing with the central nervous system and neurotransmitters. So let's talk about the central nervous system and neurotransmitters, and let's talk about the capsules, the Adaptiv capsules. Now, this is a very unique formulation. And I get excited about this formulation because I know how much time and effort was put into this and why each one of these components within the capsule are critical to its value and to its functional. So we, of course, have a proprietary blend of essential oils. We have the scaledium root, which I'll talk a little bit about, alkaloids. And then we have the ahi flower, and then we have gamma-aminobutyric acid, GABA, as a neurotransmitter. All of those things combined make it very unique and very useful to the body for these reasons. First, let's talk about GABA. Now, GABA acts as a primary neurotransmitter within the body, but it's inhibitory. It has an inhibitory response that's directly related to the parasympathetic system. Now, before you get overwhelmed and say, I don't know what the parasympathetic system is, you actually do. We've talked about it many times. It's a part of your autonomic system. Sympathetic versus parasympathetic. Parasympathetic being when your body is at ease or at rest, and sympathetic being when your body is under attack, fight or flight, or stressful events are occurring. And so it's really critical that we have adequate amounts of GABA present within our body and available for utilization. So let me show it to you this way and help you understand this a little bit more. So remember, we talked about the amygdala and we talked about the hypothalamus. And here's their involvement with neurotransmitters, that we have a stressful event which is interpreted by the amygdala, and a signal, or a broadcast, if you will, neurological response is given to the hypothalamus, which in turn stimulates an autonomic response within the body. Now, depending on what the need is, that could be sympathetic, fight or flight, or that could be parasympathetic, rest, digest, the body is at ease. It's between these two systems that the body comes into the state that we commonly refer to many times as homeostasis. Under the sympathetic response, we have neurotransmitters like glutamate, epinephrine, norepinephrine. These are excitatory. Glutamate is transformed through enzymatic action into GABA. And GABA gives us this relaxing, calming response within the body. So it's important that we have a good amount of GABA. Now, interestingly enough, you've all heard of serotonin. Serotonin is a neuromodulator. It is a neurotransmitter, but we classify it as a neuromodulator, meaning that it works with GABA so that the effects and the benefit of that can be much further reaching than what it would be normally. Now, sometimes I hear people give the question, well, this is a very delicate chemical system within the body, and indeed it is, but this is one of the great things about having GABA in this formulation, that the brain works, the body works to keep the neurochemistry of the body and all of its systems in balance at all times. And it has a number of ways that it does that. It does that with the blood-brain barrier. It does that with enzyme activity. It does that with feedback loops or feedback information that comes through the system as we go through the process of stress, much like what I showed you in the stress axis, that eventually we have normalization. However, I want to highlight one critical part of how the body works to keep that in system, how the body works to keep that in balance, and that is because the body does not utilize what it does not need in the case of neurotransmitters. So this is a wonderful opportunity in the case that we do need neurotransmitters to be present. We have as much as we need, and that's why it's a part of this wonderful formulation in the Adaptiv. Now let's talk a little bit about alkaloids really quickly. Alkaloids, now the alkaloids that we're using actually come from scaledium root, and it comes from South Africa. And there's 4 different types of alkaloids that we have, but all of them are directed to creating the same type of activity and the same type of function within the body. And that is that with the alkaloids, we know that it has profound physiological effect. And the primary effect that we see with the alkaloids is that it is calming and it is soothing to the body as a whole, but especially to the neurological systems of the body. Now, I'm going to explain to you how that happens. We're going to get into a little bit more brain chemistry, but it'll help you to understand why the formulation in each one of the ingredients we have within the capsules of the Adaptiv is so critical and so important. So let me talk with you about the stria terminalis. And all you really need to know is it's one of the connections between the amygdala and the hypothalamus. In 3 different ways, the alkaloids that we have in the Adaptiv work within that connection and that communication. Remember, we said that there's communication in that the amygdala interprets the information, and then we have the hypothalamus begins to act on the information, to put it very simply. So first, alkaloids create an action within the amygdala that it actually reduces the perception of the stress response. And that's significant because we diminish the signal then subsequently to the hypothalamus. And so the stress response is greatly diminished. Now, the third part of this that's really critical and I think kind of fascinating is that we do that without subduing other systems. In other words, we still have excitability, we still have clarity of thought and focus. It's that the system itself and how the body is reacting to stress can dynamically change because of the influence first to the amygdala and then to the hypothalamus. To me, this is one of the most exciting parts that we see with the capsules themselves. Now, the other great thing that we see with alkaloids, remember how we talked about that we need vitamins and minerals and we need enzymes, and neurotransmitters are no different. We need enzymes, and 2 of the enzymes that we interact with alkaloids is 5-HT and PDE4. And what this ends up doing for us is allowing us to have longer sustainability of both serotonin and GABA. And remember, the action of those 2 allow us to come into a state of balance, more calmed, more soothed, and the central nervous system, the parasympathetic system, begins to come at ease. And so we have a great relaxation that takes place. That's significant, especially when it comes to the effects that we see within stress overall. Now let's talk quickly about the ahi flower, because this is yet another important component and part of what we see within the Adaptiv capsules. Now, we talked a little bit earlier with the lifelong vitality about the importance, and we did it just very briefly, of fatty acids. We need essential fatty acids, but we need them to be bioavailable, and we need a good amount, and we need them to be usable by cells and tissues within the body. One of the great things about the ahi flower is that when we do get a rich source of fatty acids from the ahi flower, however, what we have is stearidonic acid, which is actually converted into EPA and DPA, eicosapentaenoic and docosahexaenoic acid, those two critical fatty acids that we all need. So we get greater bioavailability by getting plant-based fatty acids in this particular supplement. Now, we've also added some beautiful essential oils into the Adaptiv supplement. We have lavender, we have coriander, we have wild orange, and we have fennel. And they have collectively a large amount of linalool associated with that, especially the lavender and the coriander. Now, one of the reasons why linalool is so important, I'm going to give you another view into why linalool is so important with the essential oils. Now, the oils of lavender and coriander and wild orange with that high component of linalool actually gives us an effect and a benefit into another pathway. And it's part of the sympathetic response. Remember, we talked about excitatory neurotransmitters, and we said there was glutamate, and then there was also epinephrine and norepinephrine. Norepinephrine, again from the amygdala to the hypothalamus, can be released from the adrenal medulla of the adrenal gland. That happens by depolarization of voltage-gated calcium channels. Now, I know that's super exciting for all of you. It simply means this. If we can prevent that from depolarizing, then we can prevent the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. And there's a number of studies that have shown that linalool directs the activity of calcium channels. And so it's yet another way that we can help the body to manage and respond more appropriately to the different stressors that we find ourselves in with some consistency. So when we look at the supplement itself, here's the key benefits that we see. We know that we can increase inhibitory neurotransmitters with GABA. We know that with the alkaloids, we can control more fully the stress response, react and respond a little bit better and a little more appropriately. And we can sustain both GABA and serotonin. With the ahi flower, we get more bioavailable fatty acids, which are important for cellular structure and function, as well as body systems as a whole. And then lastly, we can work through calcium channels to have a more controlled response of other excitatory neurotransmitters. Now let's shift gears just a little bit and let's talk about the olfactory pathway. Now, remind you of what we talked about with the limbic system one more time. And we can do a snapshot back into that limbic system and know that we have the perception of aroma through the olfactory bulb. And then that leads to the olfactory cortex, which then can go to the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the pituitary. And finally, we have the release of a hormone called cortisol. Now, if you've done any reading or have any understanding of stress response in the body, you've probably heard a lot about cortisol. And cortisol, like most things in the body, is there for a reason, and it's not always bad. Cortisol, for example, helps to control inflammatory response, to normalize that response. It helps to control allergic response. It inhibits the immune system in that regard. It helps to stimulate the liver to convert fatty acids to glucose so that if we need extra energy, we have that. And then lastly, it maintains emotional stability and it helps to counteract the activity of stress. The challenge with cortisol, like most things, is if it becomes prevalent and chronic and sustainable. Now, earlier we talked about lifestyle factors, and I said adrenal fatigue is a real lifestyle factor that reduces our body's capacity, our coping capacity to deal with the stress factors that we find ourselves involved with. And that's primarily lifestyle choice. I'll give you a really good example of how we might escalate cortisol. Energy drinks, caffeine, those are good examples of where we have and sustain high amounts of cortisol. Stress, for any reason, over long periods of time, can increase the amount of cortisol that's present within our body. If we reduce our coping capacity, and stressful events that normally were normalized for us now become stressful in that area of risk or concern, now we also have sustained cortisol that's present within our system. And just like the other physiological changes that we talked about, We create more difficulty for ourselves when we have sustained and prolonged cortisol. Disease susceptibility, muscle wasting, and protein breakdown. That's why the muscles waste away. Increased blood sugar levels, metabolic challenges. There's any number of different things that we begin to see because we have sustained cortisol. This was one of the, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why we created the Adaptiv oil and the Adaptiv touch. Now, this is a beautiful compilation of several different essential oils. We have rosemary, copaiba, sweet gum, neroli, lavender, magnolia, and then, of course, we have spearmint and we have wild orange. Both of those, all of those collectively, have a very unique profile that we see within this blend. If we take magnolia and lavender and neroli, for example, we have high amounts of linalool and linalool acetate. If we take the sweet gum and the copaiba, we have high amounts of beta-carophylline. You've heard a lot about the endocannabinoid system, for example, so you know the importance and the relevance of beta-carophylline. And then lastly, we have the wild orange, the spearmint, and the rosemary, and they have high amounts of limonene. Now, I don't really want to spend any time talking about the chemistry of the essential oils, but I will tell you that each of those oil groups that I just described have very profound effects in helping the body to respond differently through the olfactory system and helping once again for the body to normalize its response to different stressors that we receive. And so using the essential oil with regularity is an important part of what we do with Adaptiv in an overall sense. Now, we've done some clinical studies. We always like to study the things that we do in doTERRA, and we did a clinical study as well as we did a proteomic study. And so let me walk through those real quickly to give you a better understanding of why I have so much confidence in the Adaptiv product line as a whole. So first, in the clinical study, one of the things that we did, we wanted to see if by using the product, if we could change the outcomes for the participants in our study. And what we found was that they showed improvement throughout the course of the entire study, but some of them even had very dramatic and significant improvement as they went through the study period. And then lastly, we found that the participants had constant movement within that, but they also had sustained benefits. And sustained benefits is important because we don't want things that are not long-lasting, and we don't want things that are only episodic or periodic that we can receive the value and the benefit from them. Now, that's a little bit different than what we did with the proteomic study. This is a little more complicated. And proteomics is really just where we look at proteins. We look at individual proteins. We look at the expression of those in comparison to different responses or different stimulus, and we look at that within different pathways within the body. And so most people, when they do a proteomic study, they might look at 2 or 3 different pathways, and don't worry so much about the pathway. It doesn't really matter that's the MAPK or the JAK-STAT pathway. Some of you may care about that kind of detail, but I'm more looking at the outcomes that are associated with that. So the mTOR pathway, for example, is metabolism, and MAPK is proliferation, and the JAK-STAT would work with immunity. Those are the 2 or 3 that people generally look at when they're doing proteomic type studies, but we had a different thought. We had a different framework that we wanted to follow, and that was we wanted a more comprehensive view of how the product was working and the pathways that it was involved with. Now, this is not the first time that doTERRA has done proteomic work in similar studies. You remember a few years ago, we looked at the entire human genome, and we looked at its response to different types of essential oils and blends. And we could see upregulation and we could see downregulation of specific proteins within the body. If we know how the proteins are reacting and responding, then we know pathway and we know response within that pathway, and we have predictability of the outcomes. And that's exactly what we discovered. We didn't look at 2 or 3 pathways. We looked at 11 different pathways, and the sum of that demonstrates a really profound synergistic activity associated with the capsules themselves. And so if we look at this graph that I now have here for you, this chart, you'll see that we have the pathway and the function, but then I have each one of the ingredients listed individually: the alkaloids, the GABA, the ahi flower, and of course the oil blend. The blue squares represent that the pathway, the proteins within the pathway were downregulated. by a majority sense, and that the red indicates that it was upregulated. And this is interesting because when we look at that and we look at the affiliated pathways, we can see a lot of variance if we used each of those ingredients by themselves and individually. We've done something different with the formulation of the Adaptiv in that in looking at all of those, and when we tested the Adaptiv capsule then, you know, and I'm just going to apologize, I'm just going to call it out. It says Adaptiv SG, and it's not. It's an Adaptiv capsule, so don't be alarmed when you see that. I know it's a capsule, and I guess I'm not perfect when I create my presentation, so there you go. So we have the Adaptiv soft gel, so ignore, not the soft gel, but the capsule, so ignore that. And look at what's happening in the pathways. Down regulation of 8 of the 11 pathways that we tested with the Adaptiv capsule. That is significant. That shows synergy in a whole new way, and it shows us end outcomes associated with that and predictability of the product. And here's the 3 things that we discovered in an overall sense. We have neural cell plasticity. Now, if you don't know what that means that our neurological tissues are able to respond and react much better. We have calming activity, and then lastly, we have an increase in lipid reserve. Remember, we talked about lipids, we talked about essential fatty acids, and we talked about how they're critical for normalized and consistent functioning within those systems. And through this research, we demonstrated that the Adaptiv capsule does exactly that. Now, I have one final thing to share with you in the limited time that I have left. And that is, I want to share with you a little bit of a daily process that you should go through and that you can do that will help you to achieve greater mental wellness and preparedness. And so we're going to start by looking at supplementation. We've already talked about the Adaptiv capsule, but let me also talk with you about Serenity just briefly. Remember, we said one of the lifestyle issues that diminishes our body's capacity to be able to cope with these types of stressors that we experience is a lack of sleep. And then we also talked about making sure we have the right supplementation. So do the Adaptiv and do the Serenity for restful sleep. Do the lifelong vitality, and then we spent a great deal of time talking about also the benefits that come from PB Assist and, of course, with the Terrazyme. Now, we also know that we need some type of movement, some type of exercise. Sedentary lifestyle was the other factor that we identified that reduces our body's coping capacity. And so find a way to have movement in your everyday life. We'll all probably define exercise differently. That's okay. The main objective is that you do what you can and you increase as you are able. I listed the Deep Blue products because I think this is a great way to assist you in learning to be more movable in your daily environment. Exercise. Do the things that you need to do. And then lastly, what about energy? So we have the Mito 2 Max. We have the Wild Orange and Peppermint, which happens to be one of my favorite combinations. And then, of course, Motivate as a blend, which is a great oil for you to have and have available to you all the time. And then lastly, we would talk about, of course, the Adaptiv Essential Oil. Now, remember, we have this, it's the exact same formulation, but one is an undiluted, the oil, and then the other is in the Adaptiv Touch, which is a diluted model. And so I like to think of it this way, that use the oil itself for diffusion, and diffusion throughout the day is a great way to take advantage of the essential oils and some of the characteristics that we identified. Use the Adaptiv Touch with you on the go, take it with you anywhere, comes in a roll-on, so it's very convenient. That also, don't forget, in combination and in connection with what we do with our system as a whole. We have the Adaptiv system, which includes the app. It teaches you how to meditate, and it teaches you how to have biofeedback. That, along with usage of the essential oil as a whole system, is a very profound way to take advantage of the Adaptiv system as a whole. It's been my great pleasure to be with you. I wish you all very well. I hope to see you soon. Thanks for being with me today.